When the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith on the earth?
Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief.
May our testimonies be as deep and as strong as that of Jacob, who, when confronted by one who sought to destroy his faith, declared, I could not be shaken.
Now, as we turn this page from 2 Samuel to 1 Kings, our hero of the story, at least for these first 11 chapters, will be King Solomon. And then next week and the week after, we'll be meeting king after king after king in both north and south and going back and forth, ping-pong style, trying to see the good and the bad and the ugly of what these kings do during their reigns. We will see both good and bad in what we see in Solomon right now. But before we get there, we need to spend a few last moments with a dying King David. Now, to start it, here in chapter 1, we're going to meet Abishag and hear a rather strange story. So bear with me, and please try not to jump to any conclusions prematurely. You see, Abishag is beautiful, she's young, she is a virgin, so she is chaste and pure. But she's brought into the palace to serve King David in his old age. Now, you would think, oh, is she going to be a maid, a housekeeper? Is she... Well, essentially she will be elder care, and it is for some medical needs that she will be serving him. Now, the way it's described here will sound extremely odd to our modern ears, so brace yourself. Verse 2, here is her job description. Let her stand before the king, and let her cherish him, and let her lie in thy bosom, that my lord the king may get heat. Now that does sound odd, but please understand first that the word cherish is better translated here as to serve or to take care of. And the lying in the bosom was strictly for what it said there at the end, to give him some needed body heat. Here at the end of his life, there seems to be some medical condition, perhaps a mild hypothermia, where his body is unable to produce sufficient body heat to keep him warm at night. In our day, this could be a simple medical intervention with a prescribed heating pad or electric blanket. Well, those weren't options then. And so they asked Abishag to come and provide that service. Admittedly, it sounds strange, but in case you were wondering or jumping to conclusions, verse 4 clarifies. And the damsel was very fair, and cherished the king, served him, took care of him, and ministered to him, but the king knew her not. And this is that intimate verb, to know. He did not know her. And that doesn't mean, I'm not acquainted. It's, we never had any inappropriate behavior. There was no sexual intimacy here whatsoever. This was medical advice. And so some servant is asking this servant to pay this service to the king. Some have wondered, why didn't he just lie next to his wife or one of his concubines? Then we wouldn't even be jumping to any conclusion. And some scholars have pointed out, if this is a servant giving orders to a fellow servant, servants don't give orders to the queen, to the king's wife or concubines. And so this would need to be someone that has just come to perform this kind of service. All that being said, however, I will admit, this is a good place to, at least for me, in my mind, I go to the words of Paul in the New Testament. Abstain from even the appearance of evil. David did no wrong in these verses, but the fact that we need this much explanation to reassure people, good advice for all of us. Avoid the kinds of behaviors, even if they are totally above board, that people might jump to false conclusions over. Now, let's move forward and leave Abishag behind. The next A name that we need to learn is Adonijah. And this is another one of David's sons. He's a brother, full brother of Absalom, which might make you a little nervous. And in fact, just like Absalom, he wants to replace his father as king. Now, this might be with better motive than Absalom had, because David, yes, is on death's doorstep. This is the end of his life. And so for Adonijah to think, well, I'm an older son of his. Absalom is gone, for example. Amnon is gone. How many other sons does David have? We don't know for sure. But as an older son, he's thinking, well, I'm next in line, perhaps. And even if I'm not, let's help things along a little bit. So what ends up happening is he gathers followers, just like Absalom had done. He's trying to prepare the people to honor him over any other potential sovereign. Now, the prophet Nathan, who we learned earlier, the parable of the ewe lamb, he warns Bathsheba. He doesn't go straight to David, he goes to Bathsheba and lets her know what Adonijah has been doing behind David's back. And feeling that his actions would ultimately put her life in danger and Solomon's life in danger, he lets her know, I've got some advice for you on what to do moving forward. Again, if there is a sense of any kind of jealousy on Adonijah's part, and there probably is, then even having someone like a Solomon alive would pose a potential threat. Is there a little bit of Saul in Adonijah? Well, most likely. He tells her, go see David and confirm, have him confirm to you officially, formally, that your son Solomon is meant to be his successor. Now, that's not pulling any tricks. This is something that, according to the chronicler at least, David would have known very clearly from beforehand. Again, Chronicles has much of the same material as what we see in Samuel's and the Kings. This is a helpful verse, 1 Chronicles 22:9. Words that had come to David earlier in life. Behold, a son shall be born to thee, who shall be a man of rest. And I will give him rest from all his enemies round about, for his name shall be Solomon. And I will give peace and quietness unto Israel in his days. Remember Solomon, Shlomo, Shalom, peace. That prophecy, all the rest and all the peace and all the quietness is, it's part of who he is. It's what he's named for. And he will be your successor. Now, Nathan reminds Bathsheba of this and tells her, go remind David of that. And make sure that he clarifies all of this for the world to know. So Bathsheba goes in to see her husband David. This is verse 20. She says, and thou, my lord, O king, the eyes of all Israel are upon thee, that thou shouldst tell them who shall sit on the throne of my lord the king after him. Please make this perfectly clear. If you remember, last year in the Doctrine and Covenants, at the end, after the martyrdom of Joseph Smith, and there's all kinds of confusion of what's going to happen and who the next president of the church should be. Section 107 of the Doctrine and Covenants should have made it clear for everyone, but it had never happened before. There were no precedents in the last dispensation, and so there was a lot of confusion until God stepped in with the mantle experience and made it abundantly clear to those present that he was designating Brigham Young as Joseph Smith's successor. And so here you get this same concept, at least, of may the Lord tell them who should take the place of his leader. Here David needs to make it totally clear so people will know. Now Nathan the prophet comes to King David right as this conversation is taking place. He timed it well. And goes in and confirms everything that Bathsheba had said. So here is a second witness. And by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses is every word established so that David can know, yes, this is what has been prophesied and promised, and this is what needs to take place. So verse 33 through 35, the king also said unto them, he's called his servants and his advisors around so that it can all become official. Take with you the servants of your Lord, and cause Solomon my son to ride upon mine own mule. This is starting to sound like the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. And bring him down to Gihon. There is a spring of living water. We're getting some more types and shadows here. And let Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him there king over Israel. You have priests and prophets anointing a king, anointing oil, Gethsemane. To be given this symbol of light and life and healing by the hands of those that were anointed already. So you see Solomon as a new Messiah of sorts. That's anointed one in Hebrew. A new Christ of sorts. That's anointed one in Greek. And with that anointing, he goes on, blow ye with the trumpet, announce it to the world, and say, God save King Solomon. Then ye shall come up after him, that he may come and sit upon my throne. For he shall be king in my stead, and I have appointed him to be ruler over Israel, up north, and over Judah, here in the south. He would be the third king of a united Israel. Saul first, David second, Solomon third. Now, there's a man there named Benaiah, and he is one of David's mighty men. In fact, one of the mightiest among them. Some powerful credentials on his side to get to that point. And in verse 37, he says to the king, the current king, David, "As the Lord hath been with my lord the king, even so be he with Solomon, and make his throne greater than the throne of my lord King David." Now, would David feel threatened by that? I mean, Saul would, right? This is starting to sound like, David is it Saul with his thousands and David his 10,000s? And is it Solomon with his 100,000s? Well, we couldn't have that, right? Well, David isn't going to have a problem with this at all. And I love the way Benaiah is putting it, because I think it's an indicator of a good leader that he wants his successors to turn out even more successful than they were. Because what would that mean for the people they were serving? You see, if you want your successor to fail, then it suggests that your own leadership was self-serving. I want them to think of me highly. I want to be the best leader they ever had. Whereas if your leadership was altruistic, if your service was truly selfless, then you're doing all of this for the people. You're doing the best that you can. If your successor is less than you are, then your people are moving in the wrong direction. But if they're greater than you, if they have even more abundant spiritual strength, if God can be with them to an even greater degree, then what does that mean for the people that you've been serving? It means continued progress for them. And that is a good thing. They do as David has commanded, and they anoint Solomon king. The people rejoice, as one would expect, but it's so loud in everyone's ears, all of this feasting and the trumpet blasts and the shouting and the rejoicing, that guess who else hears it? Well, Adonijah does, and all of his people, his followers, and they start wondering, what's going on? When they find out that Solomon has been anointed king, not Adonijah, the blood drains from their faces as they realize we're the ones that are going to look like traitors, that we haven't been faithful to the king. And so what are we going to do? They kind of all split. And then in verse 50, Adonijah feared because of Solomon, as if he had done something that gave him reason to fear. And actually, yes, he had. So he arose and went and caught hold on the horns of the altar. This is the ancient equivalent of running to home base, to go in and cry sanctuary. I'm safe here. Well, Solomon agreed. But not just safe there, you're safe anywhere. Anywhere in my kingdom, as long as you are faithful. He is told about Adonijah's fear, and so he sends for him. And says in verse 52, "If he will show himself a worthy man, there shall not a hair of him fall to the earth. But if wickedness shall be found in him, he shall die." Now that may sound pretty bold, pretty strict, and yet Solomon is giving Adonijah his own life. It's in your hands, not in mine. I am trusting you here. And despite of what I heard about what you were doing behind the scenes, and your own behavior seemed to suggest that I should have some concern over you, but I will give you the benefit of the doubt. And if you will be a faithful subject, then you have nothing to fear from me. Do I have something to fear from you? I guess time will tell. And it does. Now, chapter 2, Solomon's kingdom is fully established. David is still alive, but he's nearing death. And as kind of dying wishes, final advice, he gives Solomon this last charge. Verse 2 and 3, "I go the way of all the earth. Be thou strong, therefore. Show thyself a man." Although we might be permitted to ask, what kind of man do you have in mind, David? This next verse will help us understand it. "Keep the charge of the Lord thy God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes and his commandments and his judgments and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that thou mayest prosper in all that thou doest, and whithersoever thou turnest thyself." It's actually similar to what Moses had said to Joshua, and what God had said to Joshua, and what the people had said to Joshua. Yes, Solomon, you will have huge shoes to fill. And yet, it was never David's feet. It was the Lord. Remember David's prayers? "May I have hinds' feet? Will you spread out the place beneath them so they do not slip or slide?" I would just want to walk in God's ways. And son, If you will do likewise, then Benaiah's prayer will be answered. You'll be an even greater king than I was. In other words, not just be a man of God. Verse 4, and the promise will come, that the Lord may continue his word, which he spake concerning me, saying, if thy children take heed to their way, to walk before me in truth with all their heart and with all their soul, there shall not fail thee, said he, a man on the throne of Israel. God had promised a Davidic dynasty. David would just be the beginning, the first ruler from the tribe of Judah, and then Solomon next, and on eternally is the hope, but only if that promise could be kept, that covenant on both parts. Of course, God would keep his, but there's the big if thy children take heed to their way. Would Solomon? Would his descendants? Will we? My hope is that as children, we can live in such a way that God can keep his promises to our parents. Promises of an eternal family. Promises of no empty chairs. Promises that the tentacles of divine providence would reach out and bring in even the wandering prodigal. I pray for those blessings. I know my parents do too. And may we all as children live up to that. That's the prayer of David to his son Solomon. Now this is all excellent, godly counsel so far. And I wish we could end it there and let David rest in peace. But he wasn't very restful, and he was worried about a lack of peace. He had been a man of war throughout his life, right? So perhaps we can excuse him at least a little, but maybe not entirely, because what he gives, the counsel he gives Solomon next, seems to me to be merely human. Not the spiritual counsel we just saw, but the more political counsel, based on grudges that he had been holding on to. At least the natural man's side of him. We saw when he first went back into Jerusalem after the revolt of Absalom had been quelled, that he was blessing friends and pardoning enemies all along the way. But evidently, I think like we said back with Sarah and Hagar, sometimes we're raised above our natural man by the Spirit, and we're so forgiving and we're so kind and generous. And then if the Spirit ever leaves or wanes, we kind of settle back into our former selves. And that seems to be the case here. Because the next pieces of advice that David gives Solomon is first, exact vengeance on Joab. Now, Joab, I fell in love with him through 2 Samuel. Yes, he made some mistakes, but I think they were weaknesses that were inherent in his strengths. In some ways, I believe that Joab is the Old Testament equivalent of Peter in the New Testament. If David is the type of Christ, and Joab is David's right-hand man, who was Jesus' right-hand man? It was Simon Peter. And he had strengths and inherent weaknesses too. Bold and daring and intrepid and sometimes getting ahead of himself in some of these things, and a little bold to the point of overbearing, right? And that is the case with Joab as well. Well, sadly here, David kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, drops some hints to Solomon saying, you'll know what to do about Joab after I'm gone. Don't forget what he did to Abner, and don't forget what he did to Amasa. Now, full disclosure, he probably should have added, because I'm not forgetting what he did to Absalom. But he doesn't mention that by name. I wouldn't say it, but again, he's dropping hints. He does add some kindness. Please reward those who showed kindness to me during Absalom's rebellion. But then he goes back to another instance of taking revenge, and it's about that Benjamite who was cursing David, hurling rocks and epithets in his direction. Another wink, wink, nudge, nudge. You'll know what to do about him. There's kind of an unspoken, I promised not to hurt him, but you didn't. Again, to me, it's tragic that these ended up being among the final words of David, because in verse 10, so David slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. That these last recorded words were of vengeance and violence, of bloodshed. He had been a man of war, like I said, through most of his life, and he had to be, to defeat Goliath, to push back Philistines on one hand and Ammonites on the other, and to to establish a kingdom of peace so that his son, peace personified, could step into it. But yes, tragically, that strength, the coin flipped at these final moments, and it had become part of David's downfall. But by now, we have a new king over all of Israel. In verse 12, then sat Solomon upon the throne of David his father, and his kingdom was established greatly. However, the first thing that we hear about in this newly minted reign is Adonijah. And he's seeking an audience with Bathsheba, but not for the same purpose that Nathan had a chapter before. In verse 15, he comes to the mother of the king and says to her, "Thou knowest that the kingdom was mine, and that all Israel set their faces on me, that I should reign. Howbeit the kingdom is turned about, and is become my brother's, for it was his from the Lord." Now, I wish I had the right emojis here to know the tone of voice that Adonijah used here. Was it wholly submissive and simply saying, you know what, I was this close, but God had other plans, and I honor those? When he said it was from the Lord, does he know the same prophecy that the chronicler had written down? On the other hand, I wonder about that, you know the kingdom was mine. Everybody was following me. I was this close to reigning, and then all of a sudden it turned around. Oh, because the Lord did it? Was that sarcastic? Did he know that Nathan had spoken up? Does he know something were there behind the scenes things going on with Bathsheba trying to make sure that her son would be the king? Again, it's hard to tell, but either way, he asks Bathsheba for one small favor. Now, whether he's playing it off like, I'm so happy for your son, could you just do me one little favor? Or if it's more blackmail, I know something and you owe me, and so please make this one request to your son. And it's this: please ask Solomon to give me Abishag to wife. That's all. She was a chaste, virtuous virgin, a beautiful young servant girl in the palace, and I'm just smitten. And I'd love to be able to marry her. So could you please put in a good word to your son? And so she goes and speaks to Solomon about it. She doesn't think there's anything wrong with the arrangement, but Solomon is a little wiser than she. In verse 22, he responds to his mother, "Why dost thou ask Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? Ask for him the kingdom also. For he is mine elder brother, even for him and for Abiathar the priest, and for Joab the son of Zeruiah." Then King Solomon sware by the Lord, saying, "God do so to me, and more also, if Adonijah have not spoken this word against his own life." Whoa, okay, strong reaction from Solomon. He was just hoping for your blessing on a marriage. No, he wasn't, Mom. Like I said, Solomon is already showing some of his wisdom. At least some of the political shrewdness that we saw in David's final words, if we're giving him the benefit of the doubt. Because what he understands is what we learned from Absalom, who goes into that tent up on the rooftop and goes into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Now, no, Abishag was not a concubine of David. But close enough, if we're abstaining from the appearance of evil, but people are making probably false assumptions, and are they going to jump to conclusions that if Adonijah can take Abishag, he's taking something from David? Is that the only thing? Is he taking the throne? Is he taking the kingdom? That's the assumption that Solomon makes. And like he says at the end, he's said this against his own life. I warned him. His life was in his hands. And if he did well, there was nothing to fear. Well, he did not do well. And so what does Solomon do? He cleans house. He had spoken earlier about Abiathar the priest and Joab the chief captain. So if he's got some ecclesiastical connections, some military connections, then I'm going to sever all of those and start from scratch with people that I know are loyal to me. And so he has Adonijah executed. He has Abiathar the priest exiled. He has Joab executed as well, which is what David had been hinting at before. And then he installs a new priest and a new chief captain of his own. He even puts the man who cursed David and threw stones at him under house arrest. He's taking care of all these the last to-do list that David had given him on his deathbed. And he says to this curser, you're safe. Again, your life's going to be in your hands too. You are under house arrest. As long as you don't break parole, you'll be safe for the rest of your life. But don't break parole. Well, can you guess what's going to happen later on? Sure enough, eventually one of this man's servants flees from him. Makes you wonder what kind of a master he was. If he's willing to throw rocks and hurl epithets at a king, I can imagine how he would treat his servants. Well, they escaped, but to go after them, he did leave house arrest. He broke parole. And when Solomon found out about it, he has him executed as well. Now, like I said, this shows some political shrewdness, some wisdom of a particular kind. It's actually interesting, if you go back and see David's deathbed advice to him, that word pops up several times even then. Back in verse 6, when he was talking about what to do about Joab, he says, do therefore according to thy wisdom. And in verse 9, when he was talking about the man who threw stones, he says, thou art a wise man, and knowest what thou oughtest to do with him. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. In the execution of these two people, and in seeing through the request of Adonijah, yes, Solomon had been very wise politically. But this political savvy, this shrewdness, is going towards basically self-serving ends. And thankfully, God has a much higher purpose for the wisdom of Solomon. We see it take center stage in chapter 3. In verse 1, Solomon first, one last political piece of intelligence, he marries Pharaoh's daughter. Now this is simply a political bride, a marriage of diplomacy. That way, if Egypt always seems to be a world superpower, and if you're living in its shadow and always getting kind of beat up between whether Egypt is spreading east or whether Assyria or Babylon or Syria itself is spreading west, Israel's always caught in the middle of all these fights. We'll see more of those later on. So at least I need somebody on my side. Let's make a treaty, an alliance with Egypt, and we'll marry into that. But leave that behind, and now let's get to the good news. Verse 3, Solomon loved the Lord. Please hold on to that. I don't know it hasn't been the most glowing first impression in chapter 1 and chapter 2, but by the time you get to chapter 3, it's okay to fall in love with Solomon. He's absolutely amazing. The Lord loved him. We learned about that on his birth when he was born, and now we see that it's reciprocated. Solomon loves the Lord as well. He walks in the statutes of David his father. Here's an exception. Only he sacrificed and burnt incense in high places. So far, sounds like he's got a great heart, but some imperfect obedience. And in some ways, you can't blame him because, well, where am I supposed to do these things? I do want to offer sacrifice. I do want to burn incense, but with no set tabernacle. You see why Dad wanted to build a temple? Do you see why I intend to do so as quickly as I can? We need a place to worship, a specific site for holiness. You saw that hinted at in verse 2. The people also, they sacrificed in high places because there was no house built unto the name of the Lord until those days. Again in verse 4, the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. 1,000 burnt offerings did Solomon offer upon that altar. He's doing the very best that he can under his circumstances, but he does want to improve those circumstances and give God a place to call his own. And honestly, God sees the intent of Solomon's heart, just like he did with David. What a righteous desire. It will be fulfilled, just not in your lifetime. And now the lifetime is being lived in which it will be built. And so in verse 5, in Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night. And God said, ask what I shall give thee. Now, can you imagine getting a blank check from God? Here's my credit card, no limit. What would you ask for? That also suggests how God feels about Solomon. When he gave Nephi, for example, in the book of Helaman, that sealing power. And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. What you say will go. Remember what he said? Because I totally trust you, Nephi. I know you won't ask anything contrary to my will. So it's no gamble on my part. That's the kind of heart that Solomon has. Now he thanks God, first of all. So even before, oh, really, I can have anything? Then please. No, even before the please, he offers a thank you. And it's gratitude to God for all that he had done for his father, David. After expressing that, then finally he asks in verse 7 for what he'd been hoping for. And now, O Lord my God, thou hast made thy servant king instead of David, my father. And again, this little boy that would have been grown up with all the stories, the hero stories of his father. There's no way I can live up to that. And so he says, I am but a child. Compared to my father, I probably always will be. There's this deep sense of inadequacy that practically everyone who ever called to position feels. He goes on, I know not how to go out or come in, and thy servant is in the midst of thy people which thou hast chosen, a great people that cannot be numbered nor counted for multitude. They're great not just in quantity, as he describes at the end, but they're meant to be great in quality. There's the chosenness. A kingdom of priests, a holy nation. How on earth will I be able to lead people that are meant to be kings and priests themselves? I wonder if part of this inadequacy is not just comparing himself to his father humbly, but also seeing the potential of his people and feeling intimidated by that as well. How do I raise spiritual superiors? My wife and I feel that as we look at our children. In fact, I remember one time I was getting frustrated with my son, and he wasn't around, and I was just kind of venting to my wife, and I must have passed across the line because Mama Bear came out. Thankfully, Mama Bear has seldom growled at me, but that time she growled, okay, was ready to pounce. And I just remember, this, and he's this, and it's just so frustrated. And she just wheeled around and just with fire in her eyes said, he will be better than you. Whew. And beyond singeing my eyebrows, I think what hurt the worst, but actually felt the best, was the Spirit's immediate confirmation that she was right. He would be better than me. And I'm watching that prophecy fulfilled before my eyes. It's a beautiful thing. Is it intimidating? Am I inadequate? Of course. On my own, at least. And I wonder if King Solomon is feeling all of that. This people that you've chosen, they're great. They can't be numbered. So here's what he's asking for. He's set the stage, okay? Any guesses what I need? Because I know what I need. Give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad. For who is able to judge this, thy so great a people? This is more than political shrewdness. I need understanding. I need more than book smarts. I need street smarts. I need to understand the human heart by having an understanding heart of my own. And now do you see him turning outward? All the other wisdom previously manifest was to protect and preserve his own position. Now it's all about lifting those that he has responsibility for. Please help me do so. Oh, there's no danger in asking for something like that. That's the kind of prayer God wants to answer, because it's not meant for you, it's meant for everyone else. Think about 1 Corinthians 12, think about Doctrine and Covenants 46, think about Moroni 10. Those are the 3 chapters about gifts of the Spirit. And what's the advice? Seek them, develop them, even covet them. Anything that you don't have, that you want, seek those kinds of blessings, those spiritual gifts. But then he says, always remembering for what they were given. And then repeatedly he says, that all might be blessed, that all might be edified, that all might be taught. See, the beauty of a spiritual gift is it's like the priesthood. You don't put your hands on your own head, you bless other people with it. And that's what Solomon is asking for. Lord, more used would I be. So please qualify me. You've called me, now qualify me and make me useful. In verse 10, the speech pleased the Lord. How could it not? It's exactly what he would hope for. Pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. And God said unto him, because thou hast asked this thing, and hast not asked, and this is where you kind of get the genie in the lamp. Every time it gets rubbed, this is the kind of stuff people ask for. And what you did ask was good. Here's the other alternatives. That thou hast not asked for thyself long life, neither hast asked riches for thyself, nor hast asked the life of thine enemies, but hast asked for thyself understanding to discern judgment. First of all, it makes me wonder, is God pleased with the desires of my heart? Am I asking for things that he would want to give me, knowing that really it's a means of giving to other people? I hope so. Or is it these other things? Notice the phrase that kept coming up, for thyself. Do you want long life for you? Or are you like President Nelson, who I swear is the fourth Nephite? He's going to live forever. But he just wants to live long so that he can serve long. Or is this riches for thyself? See, these things, none of those things on their own are inherently evil. It just depends on what do you want them for? What's the purpose? Where is your heart aiming, self or others? To conquer thine enemies, David did that. That's a necessary thing, to be able to establish peace in your kingdom. But again, what's this all for? Well, God knew what it was for, and so he honored it. Verse 12, behold, I have done according to thy words. Now, that's past tense. Okay, done. I've already done it. Lo, I have given thee, again past tense, a wise and an understanding heart, so that there was none like thee before thee, neither after thee shall any arise like unto thee. Now, with those past tense verbs, it could either mean, okay, done. I just gave it to you. It's in your account already. Or, I knew where you were headed. I knew what you'd become. I blessed you with wisdom a long, long time ago. And up to this point, sadly, you've been using it for, maybe terrestrial purposes at best. Thank you for celestializing your hopes and desires here. Because now I know I can give these gifts to you freely. It's no more a gamble on my part. I mentioned the gifts of the Spirit. Add this one, Jacob chapter 2. That before you seek for riches, or any of those other Aladdin's lamp kinds of wishes, seek for the kingdom of God. And after you have obtained a hope in Christ, ye shall obtain riches, or whatever else it is, if you seek it. For you will seek it with the intent to do good. I know that now. You've put me first. And what we see at the beginning of this chapter, Solomon loved the Lord. Now in verse 13, the Lord continues, I have also given thee that which thou hast not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be any among the kings like unto thee all thy days. And if thou wilt walk in my ways, to keep my statutes and my commandments, as thy father David did walk, then I will lengthen thy days. Now, he just listed the three things that he mentioned in the previous verse that I'm so glad you didn't ask for those things. You didn't ask for wealth. Here it is, riches. You didn't ask to overcome your enemies. That's the honor he mentions here. And you didn't ask for long life. And yet here, 3 for 3, same ones, you can have them. Now, wait, what? You just praised me for not asking for them. Doesn't that mean we shouldn't want them at all? No, you just shouldn't put those first. If they're secondary desires and they always remain subservient to, servants to your greatest desire, if you've put me first above all other things, if the first and second great commandments are so far ahead that anything else is a distant third, then I can give you the third and the fourth and the fifth and anything else that you didn't ask for. They're safe with you. And I would hope, is material wealth safe with you? Is prominence or prestige safe with you? Is higher education safe with you? Are callings safe? You fill in the blank. Is it safe with you because you have put your focus on the most important things first? Solomon had. And so God could trust him with the lesser things. Now Solomon returns to Jerusalem after this incredible experience. He offers more sacrifice there. And we don't have to wait long to see Solomon's wisdom in action. Because here in chapter 3, we see perhaps the most famous story of the wisdom of Solomon. You've seen it before. Okay, I do want to go beyond the VeggieTale version, though. As we think about these two women and their two babies, one of whom dies, one of whom lives, and now the two mothers are fighting over the survivor. You know the story, but read it again with me and look for some interesting detail. Let's start in verse 17. Here they are before the king. The one woman said, "O my lord, I and this woman dwell in one house, and I was delivered of a child with her in the house. And it came to pass the third day after that I was delivered, that this woman was delivered also." So 2 babies born 3 days apart. "And we were together. There was no stranger with us in the house." So we were alone, no other witnesses to bring to the witness stand here in court. Okay, I'm sorry that this is all we have. So no one else in the house, save we two in the house. "And this woman's child died in the night because she overlaid it." I'm not blaming her. It was accidental, but she rolled over and smothered her own child. Tragic. But what's even more tragic is what happened next, verse 20 and 21. "She arose at midnight, took my son from beside me while thine handmaid slept, and laid it in her bosom, and laid her dead child in my bosom. And when I rose in the morning to give my child suck, behold, it was dead." Now, you can imagine how devastated she would be. "But when I had considered it in the morning," once the light of the sun came in and I could actually look at this baby and see its face and features, "behold, it was not my son, which I did bear." Now, this is easy. Straightforward case. Okay, well then she pulled the switcheroo, then you guys just need to switch them back and mother and child can go merrily on their way. Well, it wasn't quite as clear-cut case as we might imagine, because verse 22, the other woman said, "Nay, I don't agree." Okay, so now we have just 2 people fighting each other over testimony. She said, "Nay, but the living is my son, and the dead is thy son." Well, and then the other one says, "No, but the dead is thy son, and the living is my son." Thus they spake before the king. So now we have a real judicial dilemma on our hands, because there are no other witnesses. We've learned that already. There's no DNA testing, no paternity test, or maternity test in this case. There's no way to prove it. And it's become a he said, she said, or in this case, a she said, she said. And there's no way to know for sure. Beyond that, even, these are 2 irreconcilable testimonies, like I said, but the testators, the witnesses, are both interested parties. They both stand to gain and lose, and everything else seems equal. Do we flip a coin? I don't know what to do here. Well, good thing Solomon prayed so intensely. All the money in the world wasn't going to help with this one. All the live a long life wasn't going to do anything. His enemies wouldn't help. I need wisdom. I need an understanding heart. I need to discern good and bad. I need everything I asked for. Well, God had given it to him already. So the king reviews the case, restates all the facts like a good judge would. He goes over the rival testimonies and then says in verse 24, "Bring me a sword." Wait, what? You mean a gavel? That's what you use, right? Well, not in this case. They brought a sword before the king, and the king said, "Divide the living child in 2, and give half to the one and half to the other." And you can picture the servants who had brought the sword kind of holding it back like, is he serious? He's lost it. His math is correct. 50-50 split. I get it, but man, his wisdom must only be book smarts, not street smarts. Doesn't he understand what this would mean for the child? And for the mothers? They're both equally hurting, and no one gets the help. This correct, but cold and calculating. Can we get a little human warmth here before we snuff out a life? Well, is it that Solomon just doesn't get the human heart? No, the exact opposite is true. He knows exactly He has an understanding heart, and as a result, he understands the heart of a mother. And so the famous moment, verse 26, then spake the woman whose the living child was unto the king. For her bowels yearned upon her son. And she said, O my Lord, give her the living child, and in no wise slay it. But the other said, let it be neither mine nor thine, but divide it. Then the king answered and said, give her the living child, and in no wise slay it. She, the first, is the mother thereof. This is so famous. And I hope that our understanding, our familiarity with it, doesn't lessen just how ingenious it was what Solomon just did. I know a mother. A mother's love, ideally, is so selfless that even having a child won't be about her and the time she gets to spend with it and what it makes her look like and what it makes her feel. Remember back to Hannah. She wasn't even going to be able to raise this son, but I just want to have something to give to God. I want him to have a life right there in the tabernacle, as close to God as you might imagine. And here this selfless and self-sacrificing mother, even if I don't get to be with my child, I want my child to live, even if he can't live with me. That is selflessness. And there's a part of me that wonders, why didn't the other woman say that? Was she kind of slow to the game? Is she, whoa, that's genius. Why didn't I think it? Oh, it's not too late. Oh, definitely, I agree. Make sure that you don't, let her have it. And now instead of playing tug of war, they're playing hot potato. And then Solomon's like, darn it, that didn't work. Now what? Well, she said it first. I don't know. Now, what's actually interesting is not only does the true mother reveal her true mother heart, the other woman reveals the darkness of her own heart too. You see, it's one thing to just be selfish, and I want it, but to be so hatefully selfish that it's not just I want it, it's that as long as she doesn't get it, then I'm okay, even if I don't get it either. I can handle suffering as long as they suffer just as much as I do. That's sick and twisted. That's like the child that is going to lose the toy to their friend, and so they break it. And that way neither one of us gets to play with it. She's going to go along with this. This is depraved. Well, verse 28, all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had judged. They feared the king, and as in reverenced, honored him in awe. For they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to do judgment. So I guess the real wisdom was divine, not human. The real awe they felt was upward to God, not just over to the king. But again, to this day, we honor the wisdom of Solomon. Those are synonymous terms, all because of this story. Now, as well known as it is, there is one essential detail that always seems to be passed over. In fact, I passed it over on the way to this story because I wondered if you'd notice. Go back to verse 16 and let's learn something about these women that is absolutely essential to the story. Then came there two women. This is the very first verse of the story, and we're introduced to these women here. There came these two women, then the next three words are all important, that were harlots unto the king, and stood before him. Those are the most revealing three words in the entire narrative. And once you understand that detail, so much else in this story falls into place. Remember when it said, they dwelt in one house? Oh, these are harlots. This is a house of prostitution. This is a den of iniquity. When they said there was no man in the house, I just thought that you meant there were no witnesses. No, that means there was no work. I didn't want to let my mind go there. There was no man okay, so there they were recovering from some unwanted pregnancy and childbirth that kept them from working, and now they have children, not children, they have illegitimate children, both of them. That's what's going on. These are two prostitutes fighting over an illegitimate child. One died, one lived. Does this change things? Because if Solomon were strict, if he was a stickler, can you picture him still saying, bring me the sword, but this time saying, cut them all in half, clean up the kingdom, get these things out of my sight. Can you picture how harsh and judgmental he could be, knowing the profession of these two women? But that's what amazes me about not just his wisdom, but what he had said, or what the earlier verse had said, his understanding heart. It was because of that that he could see past a wicked profession, to see humanity hiding down below. That this was not a prostitute fighting over an illegitimate child. This was a mother who deserved to be with her child. This was a baby, illegitimate or not. He deserves to be nursed and raised by a mother who loves him. I am so grateful that Solomon had the eyes to see justice, but also had eyes to see through a rough exterior to a heart that needed to be understood by an understanding heart. I've often said to students that great verse in JST of Matthew 7, judge not unrighteously, but judge righteous judgment. Solomon nails it because he judges without becoming judgmental. Can we do that? Or do we just see the rough exterior and I'm not even going to pay attention to what they're saying. Get it all out. No, I'm here to help. I'm here to help, no matter where you're coming from. I'm amazed by that. No wonder the people are in awe of their king. This is a good heart. Now, chapter 4, Solomon's reign extends. You see at the beginning of this chapter a list of people that he appoints to assist in governing the kingdom. He places 12 officers over the house of Israel so that they can be of assistance to him. And he's going to need all the help he can get because verse 20 says that Judah and Israel were many. Well, how many? As the sand which is by the sea in multitude. Sound like the Abrahamic covenant is being fulfilled? There they were, eating, drinking, making merry, and Solomon reigned over all kingdoms from the river unto the land of the Philistines, and unto the border of Egypt. They brought presents and served Solomon all the days of his life. Go on, verse 24. He had peace on all sides round about him, and Judah and Israel, south, north, dwelt safely. Every man under his vine and under his fig tree, from Dan, way up north, even to Beersheba, way down south, all the days of Solomon. This is a reign of prosperity and peace. The whole house of Israel is living up to the name of its king. Well, verse 29, speaking again of what we've already seen, God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding, exceeding much, and largeness of heart. How large? Even as the sand that is on the seashore. Now put verse 20 and verse 29 side by side, and what did you just see? How big was Israel back in 20? Oh, sands of the sea. How big was Solomon's heart? 29. Oh, big as the sands of the sea. I get it. Solomon, I want you to love your people. I want you to come to know them and understand them down to the very last grain. If God knows stars without number, but knows them all by name, then he knows who you are too. And I'm so grateful for that just understanding in Solomon that his heart is big. That's my favorite one, largeness of heart. We saw an understanding heart. Well, how about a big one? Big enough for a prostitute to fit in and not feel like a prostitute, not to be looked down upon, but I'm a mother in Israel. And I want to live into this. Is this another version of the woman taken in adultery? And Jesus seeing past that and judging without being judgmental? Oh, so beautiful. However large your family, however large your ward, however large your circle of influence, pray for a heart that's even larger. God will give it to you. In verse 30, Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the children of the east country and all the wisdom of Egypt. Now, remember the wise men that came to Bethlehem, they came from where? The east. Or think about the wonders of the ancient world, like the pyramids. Imagine Temple of Karnak. The people from the east and from Egypt are famous for their wisdom. And yet, who's even better known for wisdom than that? Yeah, Solomon. Or how about this list? He was wiser than all men, than Ethan the Ezrahite, than Heman and Chalcol and Darda and the sons of Mahol, and his fame was in all nations round about. Now, I don't know any of those names, which lets you know. They didn't explain any of this, but they must have been famous in their day. Man, have you heard about Ethan? No one ever has been that wise. Well, he's quickly eclipsed by one far wiser than he. And the fact that we know Solomon and don't know any of those others, Solomon's fame outlived them all. In verse 32, he spake 3,000 proverbs. That's why the book of Proverbs is usually assigned to him, though we don't know if he wrote them all. His songs were 1,005. Well, he was a psalmist, just like his dad was. Both Psalms and Proverbs, by the way, are part of the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. And wisdom from Solomon, you better believe it. He spake of trees, from the cedar tree that is in Lebanon, even unto the hyssop that springeth out of the wall. He spake also of beasts, and of fowl, and of creeping things, and of fishes. I love the list, because to me it suggests that he had such a far-ranging intellect and an understanding of so many subjects. He could probably talk about anything. You go in and bring up a subject, and he's like, oh yeah, I read something. I saw a TED Talk on that. To understand, it reminds me of President Eyring. He said about his dad, that he'd strike up a conversation with anybody. The guy at the gas station and said, tell me what you know about pumping gas. I want to learn from you. And he just said, it was embarrassing as a child, but he said, my dad really loved to learn. And to have that kind of wisdom, understanding, largeness of heart, just, you want to talk about trees? Oh, which one? Cedar, hyssop, beasts, what, fowl, creeping things, fish? Let's go there. I also wonder if those were helpful to him in teaching settings, as he's passing judgment and trying to teach people how to live the law, because a good analogy goes a long way. Jesus, whose wisdom surpassed the wisdom of Solomon, talk about knowing fish and making fishers of men. Talk about knowing trees, and speaking of sycamore trees and fig trees. Talk about knowing fowls, like the sparrow that falls, or beasts as a good shepherd. The parables of Jesus were talk about wisdom literature, but in a way that even the humblest of people could understand something. I'll admit, I'm a fan of analogies. I'm constantly trying to think of better ones that will help take some ethereal concept and put it in concrete so people can actually see it and feel it and touch it and work with it and make sense of it. I think sometimes I even overdo that, guilty as charged. But I think there's something worth seeking, the wisdom to make lessons out of life. And Solomon has it. No wonder, verse 34, there came of all people to hear the wisdom of Solomon, from all kings of the earth which had heard of his wisdom. It speaks highly of them, they know where to find it, but also highly of Solomon. Well, why do you think I asked for it? To bless the world. And here I have a chance to consecrate my gifts for the benefit of others. Now, the ultimate consecrating gift is going to come now in chapter 5 and chapter 6 as he builds the temple. Everyone's coming. Well, let's give them something to really come to. Verse 1 of chapter 5, Hiram, king of Tyre, that was one of Dad's friends, helped build the palace of David. He sent his servants unto Solomon, for he had heard that they had anointed him king in the room of his father. For Hiram was ever a lover of David. Oh, good reason and good thing, because it came back to bless Israel. The goodness that David had shown Hiram is now coming back to bless Solomon and all the house of Israel. There's later in chapter 7, by the way, there is a little extra detail about Hiram. It says about him that he was a widow's son of the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a worker of brass, and he was filled with wisdom and understanding and cunning to work, all works in brass. So Hiram is the son of a mixed faith marriage. His mom is an Israelite from the tribe of Naphtali. She's a widow, so maybe that's why she, I don't know, was no one else in Naphtali willing to take the added responsibility of caring for a widow? Is that why she married outside of Israel to a man from Tyre? I think Tyre and Sidon is a phrase that describes some kingdoms to the northwest of Israel, there on the coast. And this man, Hiram's father, was a worker in brass. Well, what a match made in heaven. Because from his mother's side, I would imagine Hiram gains a love of Israel. He's half Israelite. But from his father, he gains a skill set that makes him so useful to people, including the kings of Israel. It's like from one side, in a way, this is like, from Dad, I'm going to plunder the riches of Egypt. Or I'm going to plunder the skill set of Tyre and learn how to work in metalwork and craftsmanship, to be cunning in work, skilled. And from Mother, I'll know what to do with it. Tabernacle implements and furnishings instead of golden calves. Well, literally, that's exactly what he's going to do here. Talk about tabernacle furnishings. Well, bump it up a notch, and it's going to be for the temple. That's Solomon's plan anyway. Verse 3, he says to Hiram, "Thou knowest how that David my father could not build an house unto the name of the Lord his God, for the wars which were about him on every side, until the Lord put them under the soles of his feet." Dad had the righteous desire, it just wasn't the right moment. But now it is, and I could use your help. Verse 4, "Now the Lord my God hath given me rest on every side, so that there is neither adversary nor evil occurrent. And behold, I purpose to build an house unto the name of the Lord my God. As the Lord spake unto David my father, saying, Thy son, whom I will set upon thy throne in thy room, he shall build an house unto my name." My father was patient until the right time came. Well, now that the right time has come, patience has passed, and I'm ready to be proactive. Let's take this bull by the horns. In fact, let's make some horns on some bulls, some oxen. Can you do that too? We'll see that in a moment. But to see what Solomon is wanting and waiting and ready now to accomplish, it's go time. In some ways, we need to be able to balance both the patience of David and the proactivity of Solomon, depending on what stage and what time period we happen to be in. If you look at a tree trunk, you will see that some rings are thicker than others. Some years, the tree poured all of their effort into growth. And that's probably a good thing, since other years, they needed to pour their efforts into mere survival. I don't know which season you happen to be in right now, my friends, but if it's a season of peace, then let it be a season of growth. Lay up spiritual strength for a rainy day. Oh, get out of debt, temporally as well as spiritually. Do whatever it takes to be ready for a time when you might not be able to build temples. And both David and Solomon knew which period they happened to be living in. In verse 6, he goes on, "Now therefore command thou that they hew me cedar trees out of Lebanon. And my servants shall be with thy servants, and unto thee will I give hire for thy servants according to all that thou shalt appoint. For thou knowest that there is not among us any that can skill to hew timber like unto the Sidonians." That's Sidon, Tyre and Sidon, where they're from. I love this verse, by the way, because here is Solomon recognizing in a foreign country, Tyre and Sidon, and a foreign people, the Sidonians, material and skill sets that he and his land and people just lacked. That's humble of this mighty Solomon. To be able to, look around Israel. And in his day, he would have seen pine trees. He would have seen fig trees and palm trees. He would have even seen oak trees. Remember, we just talked about Absalom riding through an oak forest on his mule till he got caught in the tree. By the way, I forgot to say this to you then. To me, the great moral of that story, because Absalom was so famous for his hair, and you think Samson there and the lovely locks and just this symbol of power and authority and look at me, how beautiful I am. But it was that exact thing that got so tangled in the tree that it ended up costing him his life. For me, the moral of the story of Absalom, one of them, is beware of pride, for it always gets caught on something. Oh, I wish Absalom would have known that in advance. Anyway, let's get back to Solomon. It was an oak tree, and that's good wood. And so there's plenty of different kinds of trees, but since Solomon seems to be an expert on all kinds of, of tree varieties, the best one he knows are the cedars of Lebanon. In fact, that phrase, cedars of Lebanon, it's synonymous. It's on the flag, for crying out loud. Today, the flag of Lebanon has cedar trees in it. And that's what I want for the house of God. The very, very best. And beyond the best material, what if we get it and don't know what to do with it? I'm sure we could do something. We've worked other woods, but man, we're not as good as you. There is a phrase, one of my absolute favorites, called holy envy. It's an amazing term. It was coined by Krister Stendahl. Krister Stendahl was the dean of the Harvard Divinity School years ago, and before that he was the bishop of Stockholm, Sweden, Lutheran bishop, wonderful man. And he talked about holy envy. Leave space in your soul to be jealous of other people's faiths and religions. That's a nobility. That's an openness. Like, I kind of wish we did things the way they did, because that's awesome. Or, do we believe that? I wish we did. In fact, Brother Stendahl, can I call him that, was one of the people who defended the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints when we wanted to build a temple in his hometown of Stockholm. And people were up in arms against it. And their bishop said, come on, I've actually got some holy envy for these Latter-day Saints. They do work for their dead. I know we Lutherans don't do that, but I kind of wish we did. I could see myself wanting to share the blessings God has given me with loved ones that have passed on already. Here's Solomon's holy envy. Man, I wish we had trees like you guys. I wish we could carve wood like you guys. But instead of just settling for something less and being xenophobic and get out and I'm an isolationist, no, come and help. We could use it. You're better at this than we are. If you actually remember the book, The Power of Everyday Missionaries by Clayton Christensen, there in Boston, there weren't a lot of people in the social circles he walked in that needed a lot of help from the church. But that didn't faze him. He realized, just flip it around. The church needs help from them. So this great member missionary would turn to the elite of Boston and say, there's a family that in our neighborhood that's moving. Can you help? We need some manpower. Or, you're amazing at this. Could you come and train the youth of my church's congregation? They could really use your help. And he said it was amazing missionary opportunities because he recognized the good, what somebody else had to offer. And that's what Solomon is doing here with Hiram. In some ways, this is the kindest way to plunder the riches of Egypt. You have things we don't have. Will you bring them? Bring all the good you have and see if we can add to it. There's the flip side. See if you can add to ours. That's usually the case. It can happen both ways. We'll keep going. Verse 9. Hiram agrees to all that Solomon said. My servants shall bring them down, these trees, from Lebanon unto the sea. And I will convey them by sea in floats unto the place that thou shalt appoint me, and will cause them to be discharged there, and thou shalt receive them. And thou shalt accomplish my desire in giving food for my household. You see, that's one thing that Israel has to offer that maybe we don't. You guys, that's the breadbasket down there. And so if we can provide wood for you, will you provide food for us? Seems like a pretty good, fair trade. And that is something we can offer the rest of the world too. The bread of life amidst the spiritual famine in the land. The way he describes it, it's a lot of work. Yeah, it would have been simpler to chop down the pine forests right around Jerusalem, but no. Cut down the cedars of Lebanon, drag them down to the coast, float them down the Mediterranean until it comes to some Israelite port, and then drag them across the country and up the mountain to be able to make the mountain of the Lord. Way more work than otherwise, but this is the Lord's house we're talking about. It's worth every sacrifice. Now, it's going to take a lot of effort here. Like I said, a lot of all hands on deck. Solomon calls for 30,000 Israelites to help in Lebanon. And then verse 15, Solomon had 70,000, that's 70,000 more, that bear burdens, a lot of things that need to be moved. And then 80,000, there's 80,000 more, hewers in the mountains. I mean, this is a public works project on such a massive scale that all Israel is going to be involved. And that seems about right. Oh, a mountain of the Lord, and all nations shall flow unto it. That they are all bringing what they have to offer. They have a stake in this. My niece is a missionary right now in Washington, D.C., serving in the Washington, D.C. Temple Open House. And she says it's amazing to watch people from all over coming. To be involved in this and bring what you can. Come and see. And so much involvement, people giving all that they have. That was the case in Kirtland. That was the case in Nauvoo. Just come and contribute. And the saints all did. In verse 17 and 18, the king commanded, and they brought great stones, costly stones, hewed stones to lay the foundation of the house. And Solomon's builders and Hiram's builders, there they are working side by side, did hew them. And the stone squarers, so they prepared timber and stones to build the house. If you remember in the book of Ephesians, which is a great book with a theme of unity, we talk about a foundation of prophets and apostles, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. Well, they're all different. Some are great stones and costly stones and hewed stones. We're all part of this. All of these parts are fitly framed together, Paul said. And yes, there's going to still need to be some squaring done. We all have a few rough edges to be chipped off. But do that in preparation of becoming the temple of God yourself. It's all part of this massive construction project. And by the time you get to chapter 6, the temple is going to be ready. In verse 1, it came to pass in the 480th year, after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt. Sound like a fitting point from which to measure time? Oh yeah, the Exodus. Well, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Ziph, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. Sound like another momentous occasion in Israelite history? You have the coming out of Egypt. Sounds a little like justification, getting out of bondage and being free again. But then this next step, this next marker in history, to build a temple, to go into, that sounds like sanctification. I'm coming out of the world, justification. I'm coming into the presence of God, sanctification. Oh, these bookends of Israelite history to this point. And it's all pointing them to the house of God. Now, there's some construction details and dimensions listed here in chapter 6. The temple is basically going to be a larger version of the tabernacle. Larger and more permanent. Basically double everything. Okay, the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle was a perfect cube. Well, so is the Holy of Holies in the Temple of Solomon. It's just double all those dimensions, and you have this much larger, permanent stone edifice. In fact, speaking of the stone, look at verse 7. The house, when it was in building, was built of stone, made ready before it was brought thither, so that there was neither hammer nor axe nor any tool of iron heard in the house while it was in building. You ever been to a reverent construction site? I mean, that's what Solomon's got. We just talked about the stone squares. Well, they must be off-site. And the hewers of wood and the movers of things, and it's all off-site. Why? Because Solomon wants it to be quiet on the Temple Mount. Even as the temple is being constructed, this place of peace will be built peacefully. And that's amazing to me. It actually is a great metaphor also for our preparation for the temple. I worry sometimes that people go on missions to gain a testimony. Well, it happens there, but better to get the testimony first to make you want to go in a temple in the first place. Yes, some, I guess, go to the temple for it to purify them. It does that, but far more important to purify yourself as much as possible to be prepared for the temple. to be able to go and then let the Lord keep polishing. Don't go to chip off major rough edges. Do that elsewhere. And then go worthily. Now that's the first layer, the stone. Next, verse 9. So he built the house and finished it and covered the house with beams and boards of cedar. So much cedar, in fact, verse 18, the cedar of the house within was carved with knops and open flowers. Oh, you got trees of life all around you. All was cedar. There was no stone seen. First, can you imagine the smell of the temple if you went in? Cedar wood is this is a feast for all the senses. It's going to be absolutely beautiful, breathtaking. Some even said, ancient historians, if you haven't seen the temple in Jerusalem, you have not yet seen beauty. I mean, maybe you've seen some nice things in your life, but you can't chalk it up. You can't claim that you've seen true beauty until you've seen this place. It is absolutely glorious. But to walk in, to smell the cedar wood, all of it covered, no stone seen. That's the second layer. But then, verse 21, so Solomon overlaid the house within with pure gold. And the whole house he overlaid with gold until he had finished all the house. Also the whole altar that was by the oracle he overlaid with gold. Oh, no wonder so many nations are coming to see the wisdom of Solomon and making incredible contributions and thanks and honoring. It's like, well, it's not going to me. It's going to the house of God. Thank you, though. All covered, stone, solid foundation. Jesus as the rock. Cedar wood. Jesus as the tree of life. Covered with gold. Jesus as the King of Kings. The total purity. Never decays or rusts. To be able to see this incredible edifice, layer after layer after layer. Verse 12 and 13, the Lord says to Solomon, concerning this house which thou art in building, if thou wilt walk in my statutes and execute my judgments and keep all my commandments to walk in them, then will I perform my word with thee, which I spake unto David thy father. And here it is. I will dwell among the children of Israel, and will not forsake my people, Israel. I mean, why would I leave? Look at this house you've built me. It's incredible. And even more than the construction materials, stone and cedar and gold, and even more than the artistry of its construction. You're right, those Sidonians are amazing. Hope they stick around and join the house of Israel. We could use them. It's the fact that you have invited me through the way you live your lives. That you want me with you. That says a lot. That you want me here, which requires you to live at a certain level. But if you'll do that, I will be with you, because you want to be with me. Verse 29, another detail here. He carved all the walls of the house round about with carved figures of cherubim, and palm trees and open flowers within and without. Same with the doors to enter the temple. Same with the doors to enter the oracle. They called the Holy of Holies the oracle here in 1 Kings. Those doors replace the temple veil or the tabernacle veils that we saw back in Exodus. In the tabernacle, the portable tent, we want to make this light, right? So we're going to use fabric. But embroidered into it were these cherubim. You are passing the cherubim to enter the presence of God. Sound like the Garden of Eden? Passing cherubim and the flaming sword. There's the candlestick on the inside. Passing the altar of incense. There's the prayers of the saints to go through another veil to enter the Holy of Holies. More cherubim on that one as well. So same idea here. It's the same kind of setup. We are returning to the garden of God. We're re-entering Eden. There's the cherubim. The palm trees, well, there's triumphal entry for Jesus to come home. Open flowers, well, here's life, here's growth, here's the tree of life. It's all there. The chapter ends with the temple finally finished. And it says in verse 38 how long it took. So was he 7 years in building it. And that seems fitting too. 7 days of creation until it was whole, perfect, complete, very good, as the Lord pronounced. Well, the temple was very good in his eyes too. It was glorious. And we're going to see in just a moment that he will accept it as his own house. Before I do, though, can I say one last thing about temple construction? Specifically about the cedar and gold, the best possible materials that they used for it. See, the first year I ever taught the Old Testament, it was the night before I was going to teach First Kings. It happened to be parent-teacher conferences, though, and so there I was at the seminary building. It was release time in Utah, not early morning like the hardcore get. But this mother came in and sat down, and we were talking, and she was, "Oh, my son is so-and-so." I'm like, "Oh, I love him. He is hilarious and just a great kid." And she's, "Oh, yeah, we love him too. But we're a little worried about him." I'm like, "Why is that?" "He's doing awesome in seminary." She said, "Yeah, we're excited about that, but it's kind of like he's put all his eggs in seminary's basket, and he doesn't seem to be taking his other classes very seriously. He's got so much potential," which I totally agreed. I saw it in him. Still do. He's amazing. But she just said, "I just worry that he's throwing away some of that potential because he's not taking these other parts of life very seriously." And then she said, "I hate to even ask, but he really looks up to you, and I think if you would just drop a subtle hint, that I think it would go a long way. I'm not asking you to change any lesson plans or like prepare something just for my son when you have hundreds of students to teach, but maybe just say something in passing." And it was so funny. I just smiled at her and said, "Would tomorrow be soon enough?" And she was like, "What? Would you say something like, oh, I mean a whole lesson for him, and would tomorrow be soon enough?" And then she's like, no, I don't want you to, I'm not trying to hijack your lesson. I said, "Oh no, it's been hijacked. And I'm so grateful." That was a happy hijacking, because the lesson you just suggested is better than the one I just prepared for tomorrow. Because I can't even remember what I was going to do with the Temple of Solomon. Maybe just talk about, here's the dimensions and here's the cubits, and I don't remember. But when she said, "I've got a son with incredible potential that he's not living up to," all of a sudden it clicked. This young man is settling for lesser materials when God wants to make of him a temple to the Most High. And all around him there is material to make of himself someone incredible. And so the next day, what did we talk about? We talked about building our lives out of cedar and gold. Instead of plywood and plaster, or duct tape and chicken wire. I don't know. Pick your materials. Actually, you are. We all do. We take whatever it is around us, and what kind of entertainment do we take in? How do we spend our free time? How seriously do we take our education? What are we making our lives out of? That's the question I asked them, and we had an amazing conversation as a class. It was amazing to see it resonate with this young man, that it was intended for. And he has spent the decades since building a life of cedar and gold. In the midst of all of that construction, yes, we are always left with the question of what we'll do with it once it's built. Actually, not just once it's built, since it's always a work in progress. There's still more wings to put up, and patios to add, and things to beautify. But we are left with the question, as I've plundered the riches of Egypt, will I build a temple or a golden calf? Or as I've built a house of God, as I've built a house, is it meant for God or something else? We'll see more of that here in the story of Solomon as well. In fact, I'm going to skip over the next few verses at the beginning of chapter 7 to save them for part of our grand finale for this week, okay? Those have to do with the construction of the house of Solomon. We'll get back to it in just a moment. But here, let's stick with God's house. And starting in verse 17, we learn about some of the other things that go into this building, besides the building itself. First, we learn about these two massive bronze pillars, complete with intricate carvings on top. Thank you, Sidonians, for your help. They actually named these two pillars. They were so big, they deserved names of their own. One was called Yachin, and the other was named Boaz. Yeah, like Boaz and Ruth. Yachin means he establishes, or makes steadfast, or gives certainty. And Boaz means by strength. Now, can you imagine? better names for pillars of the temple. Because what is the temple? A place where we can be strengthened by God, so that we can be established and rooted and settled in the faith. The temple itself is established and rooted and settled. It is a place of strength. But if you want to gain strength, if you want to be more established, then go to the temple. That's what it's for. Next, he adds a laver. Now, this is not the small wash basin we saw outside the tabernacle of Moses. This one's massive. And in fact, it's multiple. They make 10 smaller lavers. And then this one that's so big, they don't even call it a laver. They call it a molten sea. That's verse 23. He made a molten sea, 10 cubits from the one brim to the other. That's 15 feet across. And in 25, it stood upon 12 oxen. Sound familiar? Ever seen a molten sea on the top of 12 oxen? 3 looking toward the north, and 3 to the west, and 3 to the south, and 3 to the east. And the sea was set above upon them, and all their hinder parts were inward. That's an important detail. Otherwise, they could have put all the oxen facing the inside. You still got north, south, east, west. They're just kind of looking at each other. And that would be awkward. So yes, thank you for that clarifying detail. But what I love, though, is next time you go to the temple to do baptisms for the dead, here is the molten sea. For the temple of Solomon. No, they didn't do baptisms for the dead there because there was no such thing as resurrection yet until Jesus was the first fruits of them that slept. But it was there for the washings. And to see its symbolism, these are oxen. These are strong work animals. Are we doing the work of God? What's on there? Where's the baptismal font? It's on their back, or in this case, the molten sea. It's on their back. There's 12 tribes of Israel, and on our back we bear the burden of the blessings of baptism, the fullness of the gospel. This is the gate whereby they enter. And I will head out in all directions, bringing this blessing to gather Israel home. That's what my horns are for, to herd the rest of the family. Such beautiful symbolism here. In verse 48 and 49, Solomon made all the vessels that pertained unto the house of the Lord. The altar of gold, the table of gold whereupon the showbread was, the candlesticks of pure gold, not just one big candlestick, menorah, but 5 on the right, 5 on the left, before the oracle, with the flowers and the lamps and the tongs of gold. He lists other implements for the altar of incense. This is Tabernacle 2.0, it's Temple 1.0, and it is glorious. In verse 51, so was ended all the work that King Solomon made for the house of the Lord. And Solomon brought in the things which David his father had dedicated, even the silver and the gold and the vessels that he put among the treasures of the house of the Lord. Thank you, Dad, for all that you did to prepare for this day, a day you didn't live to see. Sounds like Moses not getting into the promised land. Here's David not getting to the temple, but preparing for it. And better yet, preparing all of us for it. Thank you for that preparation. The temple's now ready to be dedicated. And that's what we see in chapter 8. Solomon gathers the elders of Israel, the heads of all the tribes. They come to Jerusalem for this dedication. In verse 3, all the elders of Israel came. The priests took up the ark. They brought up the ark of the Lord, not on an ox cart, they're carrying it, and the tabernacle of the congregation, and all the holy vessels that were in the tabernacle. Even those did the priests and the Levites bring up. And King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel that were assembled unto him were with him before the ark, sacrificing sheep and oxen that could not be told nor numbered for multitude. What a day of rejoicing. A sacrifice to celebrate the culmination of 7 years of working toward this day. I mean, if you think there's pent-up emotion after 7 years, again, go back to Salt Lake City in 1893. 40 years worth. And you want to talk about sacrificing sheep and oxen. Well, they were giving all they had for all that time to be able to give God this house. When they arrive, the priests bring the Ark of the Covenant into the Holy of Holies. And in verse 9, there was nothing in the ark save the 2 tables of stone. Now, I don't know what happened to the pot of manna that used to be in there, or the rod of Aaron, the one that had budded and grown almonds to show which tribe was supposed to have the priesthood. I don't know where those ones went either. All that's left are these tablets of stone, which is a good thing to hold on to. But just think about this for a moment. I worry that if we have allowed our tabernacle to grow dusty, if it's been a while since we've had a real place of worship in our lives, then it's highly likely that you'll have lost a thing or two. And sometimes when we dust off the Ark of the Covenant and peek under the lid, open that mercy seat, come to the throne of grace and look inside, sometimes if it's been a while, we look down inside and all we can see is the law. It seems pretty cold. It seems pretty hard. It's that stone down there. And there etched into it are the things I haven't been living very well. And so we kind of shut the lid again and try to walk away. It would be so much better if you truly knew what was supposed to be in there. Because like I said, if we're only looking at law and seeing God's harsh justice, no, remember what's it meant to be inside the covenant, the pot of manna. Do you remember all that God has given you? Providing for you your daily bread? And the rod of Aaron, the one that was used to lift Israel as they held it high and Israel won the battle down below, the rod that was raised so the sea would part, this rod is the strength of God, the authority of God, the guidance of God. And if I know of God's blessings day by day and of his guidance and direction, boy, does it change my perspective on those stone tablets. They're not so hard anymore. Well, they're kind of softer. They've softened quite a bit. And I see all that God is giving me as part of the covenant. It's so much bigger and better than just keeping cold commandments. Okay, so dust it all off. Look under the lid. Make sure it's all in there. And look for the hand of God and more than just giving us commandments on what to do. Something else to see here. Verse 10. Came to pass, when the priests were come out of the holy place, that the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud. For the glory of the Lord had filled the house of the Lord. He's come. He's accepting his house. This was the pillar of fire, the cloud of smoke. This is the tabernacle, now temple, and God has come home to dwell among us. In verse 12, then spake Solomon, the Lord said that he would dwell in the thick darkness. There he is, he's in it. I have surely built thee an house to dwell in, a settled place for thee to abide in forever. No more portable tabernacle. Now a permanent temple. No more shifting sands, but a rock of the Redeemer upon which to build. All that portable versus permanent that we talked about at the beginning of the material this week, it's happening. The pendulum has shifted to a better side. In verse 14, the king then turns his face about and blessed all the congregation of Israel. And all the congregation of Israel stood. Okay, sounds like something important is about to happen. You better believe it. And he said the dedicatory prayer. From verse 15 all the way through 53 is this dedicatory prayer, and it's glorious. When I was in college, I was a history major, and I was taking a class on historiography, the kind of the writing of history and how do you do history. And it wasn't a specific subject. We were just trying to master the discipline. And so the professor assigned us a research paper on anything we wanted, which was kind of nice. Guess what I picked? Religious nerd that I am. I wanted to do a research project on the history of temple dedicatory prayers. It was easier then. There were only like 49. But I read them all, and in that research, my thesis statement ended up being that all subsequent temple dedicatory prayers are based and patterned and fashioned upon the models of the two prayers that are canonized in Scripture. 1 Kings chapter 8, dedication of the Temple of Solomon, and Doctrine and Covenants 109, dedication of the temple in Kirtland. Those two dedicatory prayers are beautiful. And all the prayers that have come ever since are beautiful too, because they're based on this pattern. Some more closely, some more loosely, but elements that you see here, I've seen in every dedicatory prayer I've read since, and now I've read well over 100. They just keep coming, and let them keep coming. In fact, I was just in Billings, Montana. Shout out to all of my wonderful new friends in Billings. And I got off the plane, and the first thing I did in the airport was look up on my phone the dedicatory prayer of the Billings, Montana temple. I thought, this is my first time in this lovely city, and who better to give me my first introduction than the Lord and his prophet, as the two of them were talking about moving in. Lord, welcome to Billings. Here's your house. Let me tell you a little bit about the neighborhood. And to see a few details as I spoke with some of the members there and realized, okay, yes, this was an inspired prayer, as they all are. Whenever you go to a new place, if there's a temple there and you want to know how God feels about the place, read the dedicatory prayer. It's amazing. It is the spread of sacred space emanating out from the house that we're giving to God. It's beautiful. So let's see this dedicatory prayer. We won't read every verse. You can and should. But here's a few highlights. Verse 15, first word, blessed. Blessed be the Lord God of Israel. It's not even bless us because we did all this work to give you a house. No, bless you for letting us, for giving us some sweat equity in the house of God, because, with that sweat, I am eating bread all the days of my life, the most living bread of all. Thank you for giving me a stake here in your house and letting me in, letting me be a part of it. What was the first word in the dedicatory prayer of the Kirtland Temple? I like that one even better. No offense, Solomon. It was thanks. Not you're welcome for what we did. Thanks. Thanks for telling us something we could do. For the God that does everything for us. Thanks for telling us a way we could give you something when you seem to have everything your own. Thanks for establishing a sanctuary in the midst of a wicked world, and one that you feel comfortable entering, and one you let us enter to. So beautiful. Blessed be the Lord God of Israel. Next, he speaks of his father's desire to build a temple and the fulfillment of that desire on that day. Then in verse 22, Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the congregation of Israel and spread forth his hands towards heaven. And he said, so now another prayer. Which was the prayer? The whole thing seems to be one long prayer, but separate prayer. Have you ever had a prayer that needed its own opening prayer? Because that sounds like what's happening here. Solomon has addressed God and praised him and blessed him. And then he moves to the altar and raises his hands, lifts them heavenward. And now the real dedication begins. He says, Lord God of Israel, there is no God like thee, in heaven above or on earth beneath, who keepest covenant and mercy with thy servants that walk before thee with all their heart. I've never known a God like thee, one that can be so fully trusted, because you keep covenant. In fact, one that can be so fully relied upon even when we don't keep covenant, because you also keep mercy right alongside it. Why do you think we call the lid of the Ark of the Covenant the mercy seat? The entire covenant is covered with that mercy. He keeps both of them and simply asks that we walk before him with all our hearts. In verse 27, but will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, the heaven and heaven of heavens cannot contain thee. How much less this house that I have builded. That verse always reminds me of Uncle Bill, the architect of the San Diego Temple. I've mentioned him before. And he's an incredibly successful commercial architect there in San Diego and has built things for major corporations that are incredible. Won all kinds of awards. But when the church approached him and said, Brother Lewis, will you design a house for the Lord here in San Diego? And just to feel the weight on his shoulders as he thought along Solomon's lines, but how do I create something for the Creator? Especially here in San Diego, where it seems like he spent a lot of extra time beautifying things, because it's tough to beat San Diego. Hallowed. The heaven of heavens cannot contain thee. Do your best. It'll be good enough. I think he did. I think he pulled it off. Well, with the Lord's help. And Solomon did too. He continues his prayer, verse 29, that thine eyes may be open toward this house night and day, even toward the place of which thou hast said, my name shall be there, that thou mayest hearken unto the prayer which thy servant shall make toward this place. You see, if God's eyes are open toward this house, and if our prayers are made toward this house, then guess what happens in the house? God's eyes and our prayers meet. His eyes and our needs, his ears and our cries for help. The temple is the place where heaven and earth come together. It's the place of the veil, and veils are meant to be thin, practically transparent. For us to see God, for him to see us. I sense the prayer role in that verse of sending our prayers to the house of the Lord in hopes that he will see our needs and meet them. I have a testimony that he does. In verse 30, he asks, hearken thou to the supplication of thy servant and of thy people Israel when they shall pray toward this place. And hear thou in heaven thy dwelling place. And when thou hearest, forgive. Notice the last word. He didn't say, and when thou hearest, do. Or when thou hearest, act or give or bless. No, the first thing we're asking you to do the moment you hear us is make us worthy to speak to you in the first place. We all come to God. Every prayer we raise is a little dirty on the edges. We're not perfectly worthy, perfectly clean, but we can be. And as we speak to him, when you hear, forgive. And this forgiving Father does, so that he can hear the rest of our prayer and answer it out of his love. In verse 33, when thy people Israel be smitten down before the enemy, because they have sinned against thee. Sound like the pride cycle, revving up? So when they've sinned, there's the wickedness stage, and they end up being smitten, there's the destruction phase. Then what's next? His prayer, and shall turn again to thee and confess thy name and pray and make supplication unto thee in this house. There's the humility stage of the cycle that then leads us to the repentance stage. Then what? Then hear thou in heaven and forgive the sin of thy people Israel. There's the deliverance stage. And then what? Bring them again unto the land which thou gavest unto their fathers. I love that the happy ending of the pride cycle is the gathering of Israel. It's coming home to the promised land. That's where we want to pause the pride cycle permanently. I'm good, and I want to stay here, and I want to stay on God's good side and never fall back down into pride and wickedness, leading to my own self-destruction. In verse 41, we expand even further. Moreover, concerning a stranger, how about people that are outside of Israel, foreigners, non-members? The stranger that is not of thy people Israel, but cometh out of a far country for thy name's sake. Converts or investigators, people who want to come and see. Those visitors to temple open houses that I mentioned a while ago. For they shall hear of thy great name, and of thy strong hand, and of thy stretched out arm, and boy, do they, when he shall come and pray toward this house. Oh wait, they're praying here too? Well, of course, they feel drawn to do so. Then hear thou in heaven thy dwelling place, and do according to all that the stranger calleth to thee for. You see, temples are not meant to just bless members. They're meant to bless everyone. And here's one big reason. That all people of the earth may know thy name, to fear thee, as do thy people Israel, and that they may know that this house which I have builded is called by thy name. It's hard to think of a greater witness to the name of God that we can give to the world than temples. And as they are beginning to dot the earth, sanctifying land after land after land, Like I call them epicenters of holiness, and as they spread and then converge eventually, the earth will be covered with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Temple dedication by temple dedication. Temple open house by temple open house, as the world will come and visit. In verse 46, if they sin against thee, and I guess we don't even have to say if, for there is no man that sinneth not, and thou be angry with them, and deliver them to the enemy, so that they carry them away captive into the land of the enemy, far or near. How's that for prophecy? Sound like the scattering of Israel when the Assyrians come and spread the northern kingdoms to the point of being lost tribes? Sound like the Babylonian captivity as they drag people out of Jerusalem and Judah, only later to let some return? Sound like the Roman occupation and destruction of Jerusalem shortly after the time of Christ? The Jewish diaspora to this day, witnesses of this kind of struggle, but also hold out for this kind of hope. Once they repent, it doesn't matter if they've been carried captive. Hear them, bring them back. That's what he's asking for in verse 49 and 50. If they repent in that scattered condition, then hear thou their prayer and their supplication in heaven, thy dwelling place, and maintain their cause. Forgive thy people that have sinned against thee, and all their transgressions wherein they have transgressed against thee, and give them compassion before them who carried them captive, that they may have compassion on them. Similar things in the dedicatory prayer of the Kirtland Temple, by the way. But it's beautiful that here, as the prayer concludes, it culminates in the promise of the gathering of Israel. It ends by warning about scattering, but promising gathering, and that's what we get to help with. I don't know of anybody, any prophet in our day, except maybe Joseph Smith, that has talked more seriously and repeatedly and forcefully about the gathering of Israel than Russell M. Nelson. The greatest work we can be involved in, and it's temple-based. Where do missionaries go before they can go out and gather Israel on this side of the veil? They go to the temple to be endowed with power from on high. Power to do so. And what work is actually happening in the temple all along the way? The gathering of Israel on the other side of the veil. It's amazing to see what is happening there. Heaven and earth are being gathered together into one in Christ. This is the dispensation of the fullness of times. And it's a work that you and I get to be involved in. That's amazing. The prayer completed, Solomon then arises from the altar, a place of sacrifice. He's knelt there to pour out his heart to God. He blesses the people. In verse 56, blessed be the Lord that hath given rest unto his people Israel, according to all that he had promised. There hath not failed one word of all his good promise, which he promised by the hand of Moses his servant. Not a word. God keeps his word. He is the word. And we can bank on it. In verse 57, then, the Lord our God be with us, as he was with our fathers. Let him not leave us, nor forsake us. Well, better said, may we not leave him or forsake him. And the next line tells us how. That he may incline our hearts unto him, to walk in all his ways, and to keep his commandments, and his statutes, and his judgments, which he commanded our fathers. To incline our hearts. We saw that verb earlier, I think in Joshua. But to think about, if I'm not perfectly straight, chances are I will fall one way or another. Well, I guess I get to pick my way. Which way will I lean? And if I'll incline my heart to God, then when the shaking comes, if I'm to fall, at least I will fall forward. I'll fall toward the Lord instead of falling away. We see too much of that. Verse 61 then, let your heart therefore be perfect with the Lord our God, to walk in his statutes, to keep his commandments, as at this day. Now the first part's tough. Perfect hearts. Well, our behavior may not be perfect, but our hearts can be in the right place. The spirit can be willing, even if the flesh is weak. We can try to turn our hearts over to God and have him remake them, to make them a heart like his. But that last phrase is even better, in my opinion, as at this day. Because what was this day for them? Dedication day. Not just dedicating the temple to God, but I'm the temple of God, so I'm being dedicated to him as well. And man, I never want to go back to the little old natural man me. Have you had days like that? Have you had days where you just think, hey, good day to die? Stop the music because I'm in the musical chair. I'm on the throne of God and I'm close to him. What happens after? Do we lose it? Does it slip through our fingers? If you've felt to sing the song of redeeming love, can you feel so now? Because if you've had a day like that, a day where you just want to freeze time and hold on to the feeling, then get back to that feeling as often as you can. I love that prayer. Let our hearts feel like they feel today. If we have the character to follow through with a decision after the emotion of making the decision has passed, that's what character is, then we'll be able to act on other days according to the covenants we made on days like this. You won't just be held hostage to some passing feeling. You held the feeling you had. And even days where it's missing, the commitment's still there. And you're praying for that same feeling to return. This temple dedication lasted 14 days. Or it included a 14-day feast, I should say. After which, in verse 66, King Solomon sent the people away. And they blessed the king and went unto their tents, joyful, glad of heart, for all the goodness that the Lord had done for David his servant and for Israel his people. I can't think of a better place, a more natural place to walk away with rejoicing than the house of God. Chapter 9, then, the temple is bookended by these experiences where Solomon and God come together for a conversation. And this one, in chapter 9, God appears to Solomon a second time and says to him in verse 3, I have heard thy prayer and thy supplication that thou hast made before me. I have hallowed this house which thou hast built. I love the division of labor there. You built it. I hallowed it. We can work on construction and we can participate in dedication, but sanctification will only come from him. Will he accept the house? Here he does. He says, I will put my name there forever, and mine eyes and my heart shall be there perpetually. I love the three things he lists. Makes you wonder, when you go to the house of God, which of those three things do you need in the moment? Are you going because his name is there? His power, his authority, his identity, and the sense of identity he gives you? Or are you going because his eyes are there and he sees things you don't and he can give you direction in life? Or he sees you even when you sometimes feel forgotten. And that recognition is there as you are in the presence of his eyes. Or the third one, his heart. Are you going to the temple for comfort, for peace, for reassurance, to feel his love? Whatever it is you need, from his name or his eyes or his heart, it's there in his home. Come and take what you need. Solomon is then promised that God will bless him and his posterity after him, as long as, yes, there's a catch, as long as, verse 4, you walk before me as David thy father walked, in integrity of heart and in uprightness. You already have an understanding heart, you have largeness of heart. Make sure you have integrity of heart as well. And if you do, and your people do, then you're always welcome here in my house. I know I'm welcome among you. But then he flips it and says, but if you or your posterity turn away from God, then I will turn away from you. And you will be cut off from my presence and my promise. The rest of the chapter then describes Solomon's kingdom continually growing in strength and security and prosperity, especially now that the house of God is there. Now, blessings abound. You see those in chapter 10, where verse 1, the Queen of Sheba comes, another famous visit. She has heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord. Catch that? It wasn't just the fame of Solomon, period. It was the fame of Solomon concerning the Lord. Remember, it was the Lord's wisdom in Solomon. It was the Lord's fame through Solomon. It's all about God. She came to prove him, this verse says, which means to test him, to try him with hard questions. How could anybody be as wise as Solomon is reported to be? I mean, I've heard about Egypt. I've heard about the people in the East. I know some wise names, but Solomon, could it possibly? Well, she comes and realizes, I didn't even hear the half of it. In verse 3, Solomon told her all her questions. There was not anything hid from the king which he told her not. And I don't think this was just like he won Jeopardy that day. This is, you know my heart, you know my needs, the counsel, advice you give me. I've never heard better wisdom than that. You're not just a walking encyclopedia. You're the hand and heart and eyes and mouth of God. The Queen of Sheba is so amazed by all of this. Solomon's wisdom, Solomon's wealth, the glory of his kingdom, the house of God and all of its beauty and glory. She practically faints. She loses her strength. And in verse 6, she says to the king, "It was a true report that I heard in mine own land of thy acts and of thy wisdom." It's like, I didn't believe it, but it's true. In fact, actually it isn't true, because they didn't do it justice. She said, "Howbeit I believed not the words until I came." I had to come and see it for myself. "Mine eyes had seen it, and behold, the half was not told me. Thy wisdom and prosperity exceedeth the fame which I heard. Happy are thy men, happy are these thy servants, which stand continually before thee, and that hear thy wisdom." Now, I've never met a queen of Sheba, but I've met a lot of people that have come to check out the church, or have moved to Utah for the first time and are wanting to see things, or on my mission they poked their head in the door and started learning the discussions. Or I just wonder, that's my dream, that they'd say something like that. I'd heard good things about you Latter-day Saints. You're even kinder than I thought. I'd heard about the way you take care of each other and the community feel, but they didn't know the half of it. And the best of all, I just see the way you live, and it's happy. Happy are thy men. And finding there was greater happiness and peace and rest for me, I sought the blessings of the fathers. There's Abraham again. And to gather Israel into the Abrahamic covenant. Will they have this impression? If they don't, then what do we need to change? Let's change it. Now, the Queen of Sheba, so impressed, leaves Solomon with everything she's got, basically. Gifts of incredible wealth. And that was just the beginning. Wealth keeps pouring into Israel from all directions. Gold, silver, ivory, apes, peacocks. Verse 23, "So King Solomon exceeded all the kings of the earth for riches and for wisdom." Just makes you wonder which was more impressive to them, or even which was more impressive to him. His focus from the very start was on wisdom. But lately, more and more, we keep hearing about, yes, his wisdom, but also his wealth. Is he keeping these straight? Verse 24, "All the earth sought to Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart." So remember, it's God that put it there. Have you lost sight of that? Are you beginning to think it was you all along? And you think people are coming for you, or simply coming to get to God through you? Well, we're about to see what happens in chapter 11. And this is where we end this week's lesson, because this is where we end the reign of Solomon. With a downfall, like we saw it with Saul and David. It begins in verse 1, King Solomon loved many strange women. Now, not strange like weird, strange as in foreigners. Together with the daughter of Pharaoh, that was his first political marriage, but also women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, Hittites, any other ites out there that want to come and be a part of things? I mean, I'm trying to, maybe this was for good purposes when it started. I'm trying to maintain the peace and prosperity of this kingdom. I am Solomon, peace personified after all. And if I can be connected to as many kingdoms, little city-states, you name it, then they have a reason to maintain the peace. and to be connected for trade and all these other things. Peace and prosperity will be a result of this. So I think I'm doing what I'm supposed to. Well, maybe, maybe not. Verse 2, God had warned them this. Of the nations concerning which the Lord said unto the children of Israel, ye shall not go into them, neither shall they come in unto you. For surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Well, Solomon clave unto these in love. But he was wise. Surely he can handle it. Careful. Was God only warning the people, not warning the people in charge? Are they above that? Was Solomon too wise for his own good here? In some ways, I wonder at times, at least this time, chapter 11, if Solomon has become the intellectual equivalent of Samson back in the book of Judges. You remember Samson, of all the judges, this is the one with the greatest potential to really pull it off. And in a way, Solomon, same thing. Your wisdom exceeds anything that's gone before. But are you relying upon I guess this isn't the arm of flesh anymore, but is it the arm of intellect? Are you trusting too much in the mind and have lost a bit of that hold on the heart with its understanding and its largeness and its integrity? Don't think you're strong enough to be in a vineyard, Samson, and don't think you're smart enough to be able to navigate all of these foreign wives that you are now entangled with. Verse 3, you want to talk about entanglement? He had 700 wives, princesses. So yes, these are political marriages to make alliances everywhere that he can. 700 of them, though. And then add to that 300 concubines. No wonder the next phrase happens. His wives turned away his heart. Was there anything left in his heart for God or for his own people? For it came to pass when Solomon was old, so maybe not only I'm too wise to be tricked, but I'm too old to need to worry anymore. I'm past that stage. I won't be affected. Well, when he was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. Oh, Solomon, not wise enough to handle it after all. Not old enough to be past the point where you needed divine protection. You should have listened, kept those covenants. Inclined your heart. Verse 6, Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and went not fully after the Lord, as did David his father. I wonder about the order there. Flip it around. Going not fully, and then going to the point of doing evil. Were all these connections foreign territories? It's not just politics then. Now it's foreign philosophies. Different traditions of men, different ways of doing things, definitely different gods and different doctrines. And is it beginning to dilute his discipleship? Is it beginning to muddy the waters and change his perspective on things? Is he taking all the philosophy classes in college and falling prey to the philosophies of men, mingled or unmingled with Scripture? He's losing it here. In verse 9, as a result, the Lord was angry with Solomon, because his heart was turned from the Lord God of Israel, which had appeared unto him twice. Twice. You should know better. You know me. And I gave you a heart, and now you've turned it from me. Now, with this, we need to go back and see just how deeply the world has influenced Solomon. Again, worldly philosophy, worldly wisdom, worldly wealth. If you go back, for example, at the end of chapter 6, where he was constructing the temple with Hiram of Tyre, it gave us that little quick insight into how long it took. But then we stopped. And there's a chapter break and a chapter heading, and I got to go to bed and wake up tomorrow, and I forget what I read the night before, and I just start fresh. And now we're talking about something different. And I skipped over those first dozen verses or so from chapter 7. But let's go back and be Hebrews, shall we? And let's open the scroll to the end of what became chapter 6 and the beginning of what became chapter 7, but as far as they read it, it was just one verse to the next. There weren't even verses, just one sentence followed by the next sentence. So let's read them together. 6:38 and 7:1, side by side, as the original would have it. So was he 7 years in building it, the house of God. But Solomon was building his own house 13 years, and he finished all the house. And then he goes on to describe it in that chapter. Wait a minute. We talked about 7 years being so perfect and whole and very good. And wait, Solomon spent almost twice as long on his own house? 13 years? Oh, just shy of 14. Was he trying to be doubly perfect? Well, if he was, he fell short of that in a major way. It makes me a little worried sometimes to think of how much time do we spend building the kingdom of God versus how much time do we spend building our own kingdoms. And it doesn't have to be, again, the Lord asks for his seventh, his Sabbath. But even throughout the week, are we consecrating our all? Are we looking for ways to put God first in our lives? Notice this in chapter 7, verse 2, back in that description of his house. He built also the house of the forest of Lebanon. Now, scholars suggest this is part of kind of a palace complex there in Jerusalem. The length thereof was 100 cubits, the breadth thereof 50 cubits, the height thereof 30 cubits, upon 4 rows of cedar pillars with cedar beams upon the pillars. This is bigger than the temple by quite a bit. Can you imagine? It's almost like, oh, look who moved into the neighborhood in the small house. It's the Lord. And well, good for him. I mean, if you're living the smallest house in a big neighborhood, then it's good for their property values. And so maybe the Lord finally can get ahead in life. I'm just worried. I'm worried for you, Solomon, that all of your good intentions from earlier on in life have now shifted back to bless you, even more than you're trying to bless God and others. In chapter 7, verse 10 and 11, the foundation was of costly stones, great stones, stones of 10 cubits, stones of 8 cubits. Above were costly stones after the measure of hewed stones and cedars. Wait, didn't we already read a verse about costly stones and great stones for a foundation? Yeah, that was the foundation of the temple, though. This is the foundation of Solomon's house. Trying to make his own house a temple for himself. And then go back to chapter 10, in verse 18 through 20, back to Solomon's palace. Moreover, the king made a great throne of ivory. If you remember, the Ark of the Covenant is the throne of God, and that was shittim wood, acacia. Would that not be good enough for you? No, he wants ivory, a great throne. He overlaid it with the best gold. The throne had 6 steps. On the top of the throne was round behind, and there were stays. That's armrests. On either side, on the place of the seat. It's starting to sound a little like what King Noah had made. There are 2 lions stood beside the stays. Maybe that symbolizes Israel and Judah, since I am the lion of the tribe of Judah now. Judah was the lion that we saw in those patriarchal blessings in Genesis and in Deuteronomy. This leading tribe, and here's Solomon himself ready to roar out over the gathered multitudes. It even describes it as 12 lions stood there on the one side and on the other upon the 6 steps. There was not the like made in any kingdom. I mean, this is a throne like you can't imagine. 6 steps to get to the top, and every step you take, there's a lion on either side of you. So as you go up the 6 steps, there's the 12 lions, there's the 12 tribes, but who's above them all? Solomon. And he wants you to know it. They say that when the architects first designed Washington, D.C., they wanted it to be a shock and awe experience so that anyone who came would just be in awe of the American government. Well, Solomon was doing something similar himself. Now, chapter 11, where we've been for the last little while, go back to verse 11 and notice what the Lord warns Solomon about. Wherefore the Lord said unto Solomon, for as much as this is done of thee. What's this? Well, building your kingdom at the expense of mine. And thou hast not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded thee. So you went against all that I've been saying over and over through these chapters. Here's the result. And I told you if then before with blessings and if then with curses. Well, you made your choice. I will surely rend the kingdom from thee and will give it to thy servant. Sounds a lot like what Samuel had said to Saul when Saul was begging, no, please don't leave. And Samuel turns away and Saul grabs his cloak and rips it. And then Samuel says, thanks for the visual aid. God will rend the kingdom from you as well. And here's God promising or warning Solomon of the same. In verse 12, notwithstanding, in thy days I will not do it. So the kingdom will at least outlive you. And why? Not because you're so good, but rather for David thy father's sake. But I will rend it out of the hand of thy son. Your father had mistakes. He made mistakes, but he was faithful enough to bless your life. You haven't been faithful enough to bless the life of your son. And so during your son's reign, that's when the kingdom will be rent, torn away from him. In verse 13, I will not rend away all the kingdom, but will give one tribe to thy son for David, my servant's sake, and for Jerusalem's sake, which I have chosen. That's why there's going to be a kingdom of Israel in the north with 10 tribes, and here, just the kingdom of Judah down south. They might consider it one tribe, although Simeon's in there and others are close, and you'll get people like Lehi and others that kind of stream into Jerusalem. They do have a temple there after all. We'll see some of that in the next few weeks. But this rending of the kingdom, that's going to be personified in a man named Jeroboam that we'll get to know next week. He's going to become the first king of the north up in Israel, while Solomon's son Rehoboam is the king in the south that gets his little scrap from what is being torn apart. This is, you see it acted out in the next few verses. Verse 26, Jeroboam, Solomon's servant, even he lifted up his hand against the king. We'll wait for next week to watch it happen. But verse 28, the man Jeroboam was a mighty man of valor, the kind of guy that Solomon could have counted on if he'd been more faithful and deserved it. And Solomon, seeing the young man that he was industrious, he made him ruler over all the charge of the house of Joseph. Well, he was going to have charge over a lot more than that. You see, the prophet Ahijah, another one we don't know enough about the backstory. I wish I knew more about Nathan and Gad, and now Ahijah. Ahijah comes and sees Jeroboam. And Jeroboam's wearing a brand new piece of clothing, some kind of cloak. And Ahijah takes it and tears it up into 12 pieces. This is like Saul chopping the oxen into 12 pieces and sending it throughout Israel. Well, this time it's chop it up, tear it up, and give Jeroboam back 10 of the 12 pieces of material. He then says to him in verse 31, take thee 10 pieces, for thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I will rend the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon and will give 10 tribes to thee. And those are the tribes of Israel. Those are what would become eventually the lost 10 tribes. Well, they were lost already as far as Solomon was concerned. He was going to lose them, at least his son would, because of Solomon's mistakes. So ironic that he wanted the whole world, and in the process of trying to grasp it, he lost the little world that God had actually given to him. A bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush, isn't what they say? 12 tribes in the hand, worth all the kingdoms in the world. That sounds like the temptations of Satan to Jesus. I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world if you'll give up the kingdom of God. Solomon fell for it. Thankfully, Jesus didn't. Now, at the end of this book, the end of this lesson, the end of this chapter, Solomon must have heard something about Jeroboam, because in verse 40, he sought therefore to kill Jeroboam. And Jeroboam, self-preservation, arose, fled to Egypt unto Shishak, king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. Sound a little like Jesus? As a young boy, when Mary and Joseph are trying to flee Herod, and they go and then only come back to Israel when they know that Herod has died. That's the story with Jeroboam. Sadly, Solomon, who was supposed to be a type and shadow of Jesus, he started that way, has now become a type and shadow of Herod. He has totally flipped sides to the point that he's trying to kill someone that in a way will succeed him. This is going back to David and Uriah, or Saul and David. Are we seeing the patterns develop enough that we should be nervous for ourselves, you mighty kings and queens of Israel, not to follow these negative examples? You see, verse 43, it's over. Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son reigned in his stead. I guess we're ready for next week now. And we can see the kingdom split, and who follows Rehoboam and who follows Jeroboam. But just like David, it's so sad that some of the last things we hear from Solomon is back to this political wisdom, not the spiritual kind, the shrewdness and the cunning and the self-preservation and wink, wink, nudge, nudge, take care of these people, you'll know what to do. And here Solomon, I got to take care of Jeroboam so my son stands a chance. How there are more parallels between Saul, David, and Solomon than we realize. And over the past 2 weeks, as we've studied these mighty men of Israel, it goes back to David's heartfelt lament. How have the mighty fallen? My friends, I'm looking at the mighty in Israel. I'm speaking to them. You're amazing. It truly is a privilege and honor just to sit with Scripture and sit with you, saints, and talk about examples that we intend to live up to, potential that we hope to meet and reach. With that in mind, it is so tragic to consider what we've seen last week in this, of these kings of Israel with such noble aspirations, such incredible gifts, the physical stature of a Saul, the spiritual strength and courage of a David, the intellectual wisdom and largeness of heart of a Solomon. And they all fell. I said this at the very beginning, hours and hours and hours ago, that there were 3 temptations for the King of Kings, and they matched the temptations for the 3 kings of united Israel. That's all there were. It's all Satan's got up his sleeve. I wish that Saul had not succumbed to pride. I wish he had remained little in his own sight. I wish he had been willing to just be humble and let David rise. He shall increase and I shall decrease, and I'm okay with that. I wish he had. I wish he'd learned from Jesus in advance and known, don't throw yourself from the temple, just to prove that God won't let you fall, because in doing so you did fall and dashed your foot against the stone. David, I wish you'd remained that good shepherd all through. I wish that you'd stayed in battle as you had as a young man. I wish you had remained the trustworthy servant that you were as a boy, and that you had looked away and remained clean and free of all the guilt and pain that you brought upon yourself and that then spread throughout your household. You sowed the wind and reaped the whirlwind, and it didn't have to be that way. I wish that you had turned away from the stones that Satan was tempting you to turn into bread. Jesus did. And you, Solomon, you had it all. You had more than you asked for. You got what you needed and everything else, because at that time you could be trusted with it. I wish that you had remained with that sense of inadequacy. I wish you'd held on to the thought of, I'm just doing this for others and not for myself. I wish your heart had stayed large enough to contain every grain of sand from the house of Israel, instead of grasping for the grains in every other seashore. I wish you hadn't succumbed to a tempter who said, worship me and I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world. I wish you'd just stuck with the house of God and worried less about your own house. My friends, these men, all 3, started their lives with cedar and gold and ended crashing back down into plywood and plaster by life's end. My prayer for each of us is that we can do it differently. And then instead of following the kings, we can follow the King of Kings. No one has ever lived up to his potential quite like Jesus. And though we'll never quite match him, with his help, he will make us of cedar and gold as well.